The winter over Oschersleben tasted like metal. Frost crawled across my windscreen in delicate veins, and the fuel needle trembled the way a hand does after a long night. I could smell cold petrol through my Mask B4 biting the back of my throat, while the Daimler-Benz idled with a cat's unease. Contact 12 o'clock high. We all heard it at once. I saw them even before the call, silver specks slipping out of the sun, too bright to look at straight. Then something fell from their bellies, two dark shapes tumbling from each wing, spinning, like coins tossed into a well. We used to watch escorts peel away, as dependable as church bells. They would jettison their tanks near the border, waggle their wings, and turn home. That winter day they jettisoned and stayed. The sky felt smaller, as if someone had pulled a rope tight around the horizon. They were Mustangs. We learned the name fast, because it changed the shape of our mornings. A Packard-built Merlin up front, British blood in an American frame, and somewhere behind the pilot, a small fuselage tank we could not see, feeding the engine after the wing tanks and the paper-thin drop tanks were gone. 85 gallons hidden in the spine, 108 in each disposable drum they shed into the fields below. Do the arithmetic, and the numbers answer without pity. A combat radius that reached deep, 7 to 750 miles, a ceiling that touched 40,000 feet, at a maximum near 440 if the air was cold and the pilot cruel. We had our ways. We flew as rotte pairs, and Schwarm a four-fingered hand. We knew the lanes into the bomber boxes, the places where a fortress filled your sights like a cathedral door. Courage and geometry had worked for us in 43, but geometry changes when the enemy refuses to leave. They circled above our climb like hounds pacing a fence, unhurried, measuring. We committed nose down to rake the fortresses, and one or two would drop in at a perfect angle, high right, a clean lead pursuit cut that turned escape into a problem without a solution. You can fight speed with nerve, you cannot outfly time. And the Mustangs had time to spare. Abdrahen, break left. We tried to pull them off the bombers to make them choose, but they did not have to choose. They could stay with the fortresses for half an hour, 45 minutes, if the cold was kind, and still have fuel to hunt us on the way home. I watched one pair trade rolls the way fences trade feints. One pressing, one waiting, never overcommitting, never offering the overshoot we begged for. If I sound impressed, it is because I was, and afraid, though we never said the word aloud. The Messerschmitt shuddered when I asked for more than it liked to give. Not Leistung emergency power pushed the needle where we paid in fuel, not coins. Every second at full power cost us something Germany could no longer print. Below, the bombers held their shapes white trails in rigid ladders, a geometry of factories and rail yards far beyond our reach. Above, the Mustangs redrew the map line by line, until I realized the border wasn't on the ground anymore. It lived in the sky, at the edge of their patience. That was the first thing we learned about the Mustang. It did not leave. I remember the boy in the next aircraft, 40 hours in his logbook, and a grin he wore like a scarf. He tapped the photo of his wife and child into his map clip, the way one might tuck a note into a pocket before church. He thought courage would be enough. In 42 and most of 43, our world was narrower, simpler, morning frost, afternoon sorties, evening letters. The ground crews lived between the smell of fuel and the bite of solvent. Their hands were always black at the knuckles no matter how hard they scrubbed. We flew Messerschmitts like farm boys drive tractors. Work first, poetry later. The hangars were canvas and rumour. B4 for the fuel most days, C3 when supplies were generous, and the quartermaster's mood was good. The chief would slap the cowling and tell us the old DB 605 would sing today if we did our part. We learned to nod like men who believed everyone had the same amount of sky. We flew as rotten pairs, and a Schwarm, a four-fingered hand. Our staffel was a dozen, sometimes 11, sometimes 9, depending on how the last week had gone. The briefing was always a geometry lesson disguised as a prayer. Wind from the west. Intercept here. Altitude there. The Americans would come in boxes, combat boxes. A cathedral of aluminum and discipline. We knew the
All right,
odds.
gentlemen.
When the escorts
This
turned
is the
back
mission
at the border,
briefing for
we would
tonight.
climb and set up the Fronter Landgraf head-on, where closure speed made their gunners late and our cannons loud. You didn't have many seconds of fire in the BF 109G 8 seconds if you were careful, so you learned to think in bursts and angles. 2-second tap. Count the tracers. Correct half a wing's width. Tap again. If the fortress filled your windscreen like a doorway, you were either a genius or a dead man. The American escorts P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings were rugged and quick, but tethered to a leash of fuel. They would shepherd the bombers to the edge, waggle, and go. We learned their habits the way a shepherd knows his dogs. Wait at the fence, step through when the dogs go home. It worked. I won't pretend it didn't. Some days the numbers came back at the mess, like marching bands 10, 15, even 20% of their bombers missing in action, when the weather favored us and the flak batteries got the timing right. We told ourselves numbers were on our side. The tables in the mess hall rattled with cutlery and certainty, but numbers don't write letters home. Men do. The envelopes stacked in my locker smelled faintly of fuel. Everyone's did. A mechanic kept a photo of his daughter, tucked above the toolboard with a thumbtack that rusted faster than it should. The boy who flew as my Kaczmarek wingman had 40 hours in his log, and a smile he wore too easily. He would ask if 8 seconds of cannon fire were always enough. I told him the truth we liked back then. If you fly close enough, it is. Training had become a mirror held too close. 30 to 50 hours made a pilot. At least on paper. Fuel was for sorties more than for practice. Mistakes were corrected in the air, the way a seamstress learns by bleeding on a needle. We made aces by subtraction. You can learn to be brave in a month. You cannot learn patience in a week. Our tactics favored nerve and timing. Head on, break through the box, kick rudder, dive out, extend. We knew how to unlace a formation if the escorts left on schedule. We built our mornings around that expectation. Even the flak gunners timed their fuses to the American rhythm. The P-47 had a reputation tough as a truck, engine that could drag a pilot home on a prayer. The P-38 could pounce from high with a sting that bit hard, but both drew arcs that ended near the border. Both offered us a window if we had the altitude and the calm to wait. You can teach a man to wait if he has bread and cigarettes. In 43, we had enough of both. We flew mornings, we flew noons, and sometimes we slept in our flight boots. The leather soaked up fuel like old stories. The chief swore he could tell which pilot had a heavy hand on the throttle by the smell of his jacket. I think he was right. There is a scent to fear, and another to enthusiasm, and both stain the same. On paper, the mathematics blessed us, a handful of fighters against many bombers. If we traded one of ours for several of theirs, the ledger smiled. But ledgers do not include were the faces in the debrief room, the empty chairs that seemed to multiply on days when the sun hammered the canopy and everyone misjudged distances. The combat box was a doctrine you learned like a catechism. High elements, low elements, neutral fire. Our answer was choreography. The leader called the line. The second watched for the escort strays. The third kept the sky above clean. And the fourth, usually the boy with 40 hours, kept the leader alive by believing too hard. Everything depended on the escorts leaving. We built a house on that foundation, steel frames, flak bursts, cannon passes, and admired how square the corners looked. If the house shook once or twice, we patched it with luck. That is how you begin to think you understand a war. Sometimes the Americans came with lightning spread wide and thunderbolts stacked high. And sometimes the weather came with them. Grey wool rolled out across the sky. We cursed clouds because clouds made timing into guesswork. Still, even with clouds, there was always the moment when the shepherds had to go home. Engines drink. Tanks empty. Doctrine insists. The chief liked to say we were craftsmen, not magicians. Craft can win a season. Magic wins a scene. We had won the season more than once. There were days at the rail yard when 10, 15, 20% of the fortresses did not come back. We did not count the ones that limped home with smoke. Accounting is a different trade. We called the day good, and some were. There was another arithmetic too, the one no one wrote down. A new boy arrives, fresh boots, fresh grin. The mess hall smells of cabbage and fuel. Someone gives him a spare scarf and a superstition. You watch him write a letter and wonder if he will mail it himself, or if you will. When you fly long enough, You begin to believe courage is a currency you can spend instead of fuel, but fuel is what changes maps. We could have used more of both. Late that autumn, the rumors were different. Not the usual campfire nonsense about secret weapons and last-minute miracles, but something plainer. A new escort that carried British blood in an American frame. A fighter that could fly deep and then stay, as if it had borrowed minutes from somewhere we did not know. The first time I heard the name, it sounded like a story told by someone who wanted attention. The second time, it sounded like a weather report. I asked the chief what he had heard. He shrugged as if shaking off a draft, and said the drop tanks were made of something like paper cardboard. He joked, and the fuselage tank sat behind the pilot, like a second spine. "They'll run lean, then long," he said, and flicked an ash into a coffee tin. "We'll find out." We kept flying the way we knew. Wait for the escorts to peel away. Climb into the Sunday strike the box. Count to 8. Dive out. The steps were so familiar we could have danced them in our sleep. Men prefer rituals to new gods. One evening, the boy with 40 hours asked if there were really a new American fighter. I told him the truth I had then. If there is, it will behave like the others. Everything behaves like the others until it doesn't. The next week, the weather broke clear and brittle. We stood on the hard stand with our breath, making little ghosts, and watched the sun lift a coin width above the trees. Someone said the word again, Mustang, as if testing how it felt in the mouth. It felt like a warning disguised as a compliment. When the call came, contact is wel voor hoog, I looked up the way I always had. The escorts shed their tanks. I waited for them to turn. They did not. The geometry shifted. The house we had built moved on its foundations, and somewhere between the numbers and the letters home, I understood that the war had learned a new word. The Kiel raid announced itself with that peculiar, quiet, only winter nose. We were wheels up into air that crackled like crushed glass, the Messerschmitt climbing on a column of cold. The briefing said the Americans would be heavy today, yards, slips, shipworks, keels iron, and rivets set neatly on their list. Nothing new in that. What was new was the rumor that the escorts would go deeper. Rumors fly faster than any fighter. I tried not to believe them. We took our places in the sky. Schwarm left and slightly high. My Kaczmarek tucked in tight. The other pair wide, to keep the top clean. Below and ahead, contrails bloomed in rigid ladders, the combat box drawn by hands so practiced we could almost see the pencil lines. The flak would speak first. That was the ritual. Then the escorts would turn at the appointed distance, and we would set our lanes, count, and enter. It had worked enough times to wear grooves in our thoughts. At first the dance looked familiar. Bulky shapes far above fortresses trailing white, smaller glints on the edges, thunderbolts, maybe lightnings sniffing the wind. Then the light shifted, or perhaps it was my eyes, and I caught the hard silver of something leaner angling across the Sunday. The new escorts flew like creatures that knew they would not be called away for supper. We held our climb, waiting for the old tell the waggle, peel, a straight line toward home. It said our hour had begun. Tanks dropped, wings leveled, no one left. The Flugzeugführer in me felt the geometry change, the man in me felt the floor tilt. Mustangs. There were perhaps 48, 49, not many by the standards of the bombers they guarded, but enough, and they had the look of men content to stand at their posts. They cruised high right and high left, then sent pairs to pace us. Not an attack yet, but a quiet examination, like hounds trotting the fence line, learning where the boards were loose. When the flak began to stitch black blooms in front of the bomber boxes, we moved to our marks. I called the line, checked my wingman's distance, felt the Messerschmitt settle into that narrow place between muscle and mathematics. Frontal Angriff required nerve and timing, and the winter air made both easier. The plan, every plan, assumed the escorts were gone. We rolled in. The fortresses grew like doorways. Tracers lifted toward us, white stitching on grey cloth, and the first bursts began to walk up our lanes. I pressed the trigger, counted my 2 seconds, corrected a fraction left to blot out the wing route, and the sky sliced. From high right, a pair of Mustangs dropped in at an angle so clean it offended me. One took the slot behind me just far enough to own my next move. The other slid above and outside my kaczmarek, a shepherd's dog nudging a lamb. It was not a strike. It was a conversation. We see you. We can wait. I broke shallow to test them. They did not bite. I climbed a touch, inviting a vertical overshoot. They did not hang themselves on the rope. They let gravity do the work, matching my energy with indifference. When I nosed down again to finish the head-on pass, they dipped a little and made it untidy for me without firing a shot. The fortresses stayed whole. Somewhere behind the glass and aluminum, men with cold hands fed belts into guns and said a prayer in American. We reset. The box turned a fraction. The flak found a rhythm. I made a second approach, shorter, meant to force a choice. The Mustangs made theirs. This time, the lower of the pair slid inward and showed me a glimpse of 6:50 seconds, quick as a wink, a line of light that did not miss, but did not insist. A warning delivered in grammar anyone could understand. We climbed away to try another angle and found them still there. That was the part I remember most vividly. The presence. In earlier months, the escorts lacked the time to keep us honest. If we climbed back to reset, the shepherds had already gone home. Now they watched the reset, like chess players studying an opening they knew better than we did. I told myself to be patient, and patience on days like that was a kind of superstition. We tried a high side of our own against the trailing elements, hoping to cut in where the box breathed, but the Mustangs slid again, 2 up, 2 offset, always a rotty watching the space where your plan ended. When one pressed, the other waited. When one fired, the other held his fire, like a man counting coins. They were not greedy. My wingman, the boy with 40 hours, called a contact low, left a chance to make a clean run on a straggler, but the Mustangs had seen the same geometry and declined to share. The lower of the two tipped a wing, slid into our line, and the straggler was no longer alone. We had become the ones escorted out of our own ambitions. I remember how the fuel needle Saturday. Not empty, not yet, but dipping toward the place where choices narrow. We were always thinking about fuel by then. It had become our second clock. The Americans, or these Americans at least, behaved as if their clock had gained minutes we could not find. They could loiter, we had a word for it. And, the distaste, we had a word for it. Loiter. It wasn't speed that frightened us first, it was time. The Mustangs had it. We did not. We did not lose no one would pass. Elsewhere, someone always did. The ledger would say that Kiel cost the Americans aircraft. Too flak and luck and courage have no uniform. But in our sector, the Mustangs did not fall, and I must be honest, the boxes felt heavier with them up there, as if every fortress had gained weight in confidence. We tried something bolder. The staffel swung wide and up. A long, curving climb into the sun to force the escorts to look into glare. If they chased, they'd trade altitude for angle. If they held, we'd steal a lane back into the box. They held most of them. One pair lifted, feinted, then slowed a hair and let us show our hands. When we finally committed, they did too, not in a rush, but with the steady pressure of a man closing a door. He came high right again, the place where escape turns into arithmetic. I rolled left and kicked rudder to shorten his line. He anticipated, easing a fraction shallower so that my rectangle became a square. For a moment I thought I'd forced the overshoot. His nose flashed past my canopy, silver and blue, and a shark mouth someone had painted for bravado. And then his kaczmarek took the slot he'd vacated, polite as a man offering a chair. I laughed, though my mouth was dry. It was a good trick, and it did not belong to luck. We bled speed to slide out under them, and found the flak again, heavy and indifferent. The fortresses kept their slow, stubborn tempo. We made another pass 2 seconds. A blink and saw strikes on an engine cowling that might have been decisive on a summer day. In winter, the Americans' patience seemed to insulate them. When we climbed back to assess, they were still there. That phrase repeated itself like a cough. Still there. Still watching. Still content to force us into narrow corridors. We could not brute force the lanes with escorts pacing every turn. We could not outweight men who measured time in loiter, not distance. I checked my boy. He answered clipped and steady good voice. Better than mine, when I was his age. He asked nothing about 8 seconds. He asked how many passes we would make before we went home. I told him the truth we had now, as many as the clock allows, and the clock is not ours. We took one last approach against a trailing box, banking into clear air where the sun gave us a momentary cloak. For a handful of heartbeats, there were no Mustangs in the glass. I fired, counted, corrected, then a shadow stitched across my canopy as if a curtain had been pulled. The pair had drifted into place without fuss, one high, one slightly aft, guarding not with bullets, but with presence, and that, perhaps, is the most dangerous kind of guard. We broke off clean. The flak had the last word. It always enjoyed that privilege. We turned toward home, over a North Sea that looked like a sheet of hammered lead, the needles on our panels, pointing at choices we had not made. The Staffel's radio was quieter than usual. Quiet is not always peace. Back at the field, the chief met us with his usual scowl, which was his way of saying he was pleased we'd brought the machines back in one piece. He put a hand on the cowl, as if taking a pulse. The boy, with 40 hours unstrapped, climbed down, and looked older by more than the minutes we'd been gone. He said nothing. He didn't have to. We had flown against escorts that did not peel. The hangar canvas knew it. Even the tools on the bench seemed to. In the mess that evening, someone tried to joke about paper drop tanks and American thrift. It did not land. We ate bread and cabbage and called it food. Chalkboard on the far wall showed the tally approaches made.
Confirm approach
Claims
vector.
tentative. Losses.
Vector
One
confirmed.
here.
Checking
One
altitude.
there. A gap where a name should be is louder than any laugh. I wrote a letter I did not send, tore it, and wrote another I also did not send. The boy wrote one he sealed carefully and put in his pocket. The chief cleaned his nails with a matchstick and told us that if the Americans had time, we would need sense. Sense is more expensive than courage. We had never budgeted for it. We were not fools. We knew a single day did not define a war. But days like Kiel define the next ones. The ones where your hands move a fraction sooner toward the fuel lever, where your eyes check the corners of the sky, as if they were doorways a thief might choose. The Mustangs had not humiliated us. They had contained us. That was new. In the weeks that followed, the rumor became procedure. The Pioneer Mustang Group, they were called, belonging on paper to one Air Force and flying escort for another. On paper, paper is where wars look tidy. In the air, they looked like pairs of silver sentries that did not tire and did not forget. We adjusted. That is what pilots do. We tried to bait them low, to stretch their patience with feints and dives. We tried to draw them long by threatening stragglers. We tried to ignore them and trust the flak. Some of it worked, some of the time. None of it changed the feeling you get when you climb back after a pass and find the same two silhouettes exactly where you left them, as if the sky itself had put down stakes. That night, lying on a cot that had known better springs, I stared at canvas and thought about time. How some men seemed to fly with more of it. How war could be measured in minutes as surely as miles. I fell asleep with a taste of fuel in my mouth and woke with the same taste. It would be with me for months. We told ourselves that we had seen the new escorts at their best and that next time we would be smarter. Perhaps we were right in the way a drunk is right about the shape of his glass. A month later, Oschersleben taught us the rest. We were briefed under concrete that remembered other winters. The chalk-traced routes we knew by heart launch east, climb under scattered cirrus, push past the Harz foothills, and meet them as they turned out of Oschersleben and Halberstadt. The weather officer said two words that made pilots greedy: clear air. Clear meant geometry. Geometry meant hope. We were told to watch the top Hohenzollern keep the height clean. The escorts were expected, of course. Now they were always expected. But there was talk of a concentration on the egress, and that made sense. The fortresses would be light on bombs and heavy on nerves. We would try to unlace them on the way home. We filed into the morning like men walking through our own footprints. The DB-605 barked to life. The needles came alive, and the airfield fell away with its black puddles and bundled mechanics. My Kaczmarek, the boy with 40 hours that had somehow become 50, tucked tight on my starboard as we climbed into a blue that felt newly minted. If God had designed weather for head-on passes, this would have been his sketch. Contrails marked the sky ahead, white scaffolding and careful tiers. The combat box held its slow, stubborn sermon. The flak began to speak in black commas. We pushed up to meet them where the doctrine said we should, into the teeth. We set our lanes. The first pass would be frontal Langriff, head-on, where closure speed made decisions brutal and mistakes brief. I gave the line, felt the Messerschmitt tighten in my hands, and slid the sight to the place where an engine nacelle would fill it like a full moon. The escorts were there, of course. They are always there in the story. The story is different because of how they were there. They didn't streak. They arranged. 2 from high. Right. 2 holding above. Left. And somewhere behind the box a pair, keeping time like drummers. We rolled, committed, and they committed to us, not to glory. The first of the pair swept in at an angle that made me swear. I recognized the math. Lead pursuit trimmed just enough to own my next move, without spilling speed. The second slid outward, and up to claim my boy if I grew selfish. I put my nose a hair left to untidy his cut. He eased shallower, and my rectangle became a square. He came from high right, a clean lead pursuit cut. I rolled left, kicked rudder. The Messerschmitt shuddered as the G bit the blood out of my eyes. Every second at full power cost us the one thing Germany could no longer print. Fuel. The head-on burst was a 2-second truth. Traces stitched my windscreen frame. I tapped, corrected half a wing's width. Tapped again, and the fortress held its line, as if nailed to the sky. We blew through, dived a fraction, and the Mustangs did not chase in the old way. One held my 6 at a distance that promised company without promising a kill. The other climbed to where options live. They guarded space, not glory. We extended, then climbed to reset our old rhythm, the one that had made sense for a year. They were still there, the same pair, or 2 like them, marking us as calmly as farmers measure fences. I felt the urge to force an overshoot, to bait him into the rope of my turn. I bled a little speed, rolled left and down, snapped right he did not buy what I sold. He changed his mind half a heartbeat before mine, and was not there to be fooled. My boy called a contact low, a straggler engine smoking, a promise of ease, and we started down to shear it. A Mustang materialized between thought and action, a polite, silver refusal. The first time you see someone possess your future without shouting, you learn a new kind of fear. We broke up, and right, buying altitude with fuel. The needle dipped. We all had a second clock by then, the one that ticked inside the tank. Not Leistung gave me what I asked for and punished me for asking. The canopy trembled. My gloves felt slick with a sweat the winter could not stop. They pressed just enough to keep us honest. A burst from behind walked under my port wing. Tidy as handwriting. I kicked rudder, rolled, dove a whisper, and he did not insist. He slid off, exchanged places with his partner, and I realized they were rotating pressure like boxers. Jab, step, breathe, jab. We found another lane into the box, high side this time, and committed before the escorts could bar it. For 6 seconds there was no silver in my glass, only aluminum and contrails, the clean geometry of the cathedral, and then there he was, the same neat angle from high right, cutting across the lanes like a well-trained dog herding cattle he never means to bite. I fired, counted, corrected. He flashed past and my boy screamed, "Achtung!" right as the second Mustang fell into the spot the first had vacated. They could do this, all afternoon. Somewhere else in that sky, not ours, but near enough to trouble our nerves, a single Mustang dove into a knot of fighters circling a damaged group. We heard the calls, puzzled at first by the desperation and then by the duration. Whoever he was, he stayed with that bomb group like a lighthouse, in a squall, a single beam cutting every approach. We spoke of it later. The Americans would call him a one-man air force. We felt only the pressure of minutes he stole from our ledger. My wingman's breath rasped in the circuit. "Zeal?" he asked target, the boy's voice flattened by oxygen and fear. "Seiten, Linksdeckung," I told him left side. "Cover me," and we rolled again for a quick, ugly pass to fray the box's edge. The flak timed a cough, and we slid into a slot, perhaps 2 men wide. I touched the trigger. 2 seconds. Strikes walked the nacelle. Metal twitched. For a brief, arrogant moment, I thought we had made something happen. Then the escorts closed the book. A pair from above left, one lower, one higher, bracketed us into a corridor so narrow I could smell the paint. I rolled to slip under, felt the G climb and the world grey at the edges, and heard my boy grunt behind me as he tried to keep the line. The lower Mustang nipped not a full bite. A warning and fabric sang on my port aileron. We blew through and extended low, parts banging against the armor plate in our chests. I checked him, Alice gut, and he lied well. We climbed with the last kindnesses of our fuel and found, as ever, they were still there. The sky felt supervised. The next minutes frayed. Dogfights do not happen in a circle. They happen in a stack of choices you later misremember. I remember this much. I saw a Mustang commit too hard on my boy, nose heavy, angle greedy. I pulled across his line and rolled belly, up to put my guns just where his impatience would carry him. He corrected good pilot, but not enough. I tapped once, a surgeon's touch, and his canopy flashed, as if someone had taken a photograph. He broke, smoking thin, and the sky sighed. The moment you save another man, you forget where you are. That is when the bill arrives. A second Mustang, not his partner, a different pair entirely cut down on me from a place I had believed my other pair still occupied. I hauled the stick into a brake turn, the G settling into my bones like a debt, and the Messerschmitt complained in a language of rivets. He did not miss by much. We dove together, him on my shoulder like a shadow glued to the sun, and I spiraled defensively, trading height for the hope of a mistake. He would not give me one. When he finally overshot by an inch, he overshot upward, taking the high line that turns an error into insurance. I reversed, saw his silver belly against the white, and thought about firing where he would reappear. He did not reappear there. He reappeared exactly where his partner needed him to be. Somewhere between the climbs and dives, a voice on the net called something desperate about a bomb group being skinned by 30 fighters and a single escort holding them off like a myth. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. I wanted to borrow his minutes. We had built our year on the certainty that escorts leave. That day, the escorts waited for us. Fuel ran the meeting. I glanced down and saw the needle's opinion. We could keep fighting bravely, or we could keep flying tall. We could not do both for long. I told the boy,
"It has been
"Noch
an
einmal,
honor to
one
fly
more
with you,
pass."
my friend.
And he answered,
The honor was all
with
mine.
the word men use when they trust you more than the weather. Verstanden. We tried a last cut at the tail of the procession, where wanderers collect. The Mustangs swept the gutters as if paid to. I did not admire them then. I admire them now. The pass brought us nothing but heartbeats, and those we were nearly out of. We turned west into lights that could not warm us, the North Sea slate and ugly beneath, and the radios filled with the fatiguing chorus of men asking the sky for a little more. The airfield strip looked like a piece of ribbon hammered flat. Touchdown rattled teeth, and the Boff 109 complained one last time as if it were allowed an opinion. We taxied in on fumes. When the engine stopped, the silence felt carnivorous, as if it wanted to eat our words before we could say them. In the debrief, the room was smaller than usual. The map on the wall had learned new holes. We described angles and bursts, and the way silver pairs rotated pressure like clockwork. Someone mentioned the single Mustang who never seemed to run out of minutes. The intelligence officer took notes, as if minutes could be requisitioned. They cannot. The chief mechanic came late, his hands still black at the knuckles. He pulled a photograph from his pocket, his little girl, her face a question, and set it on the table, as if to ask whether anyone else had brought something that mattered. No one answered. The boy with 50 hours looked at his boots as if the mud were letters he could read. When he glanced up, he looked older, in a way that sleep cannot fix. We learned later, there are always laters, that the Americans had a name for the man who stayed with the 400 and first for half an hour. James Howard, flying a P-51 they called Ding Hao. They gave him a medal a year to the day later, on January 11th, 1945. He earned it that morning in our sky, and I say that without bitterness. On the day itself, we did not know names. We knew only the taste of fuel and the sound courage makes when it meets a clock, it cannot beat. Outside, the wind had tired. The mechanics worked with the concentration of men who fix what they love, because it is what they can fix. One of them, the quiet one, slid his daughter's photo back into his pocket without looking at it. He touched the cowling the way a doctor touches a pulse. "Morgan," he said tomorrow, because tomorrow was the only promise anyone was allowed to make. If you had asked me that night what had changed at Oschersleben, I might have said nothing clever. I might have said only this: we had waited for the escorts to leave. That day, the escorts waited for us. By spring, the war began to speak a language we did not like. Schedules and shortages. The chalkboard in operations became a ledger of everything. We lacked fuel first, then parts, then hours. Training time went lean. A new pilot would arrive with 30 to 50 hours in his book, less a curriculum than a rumor, and we would show him how to survive with diagrams, hand signals, and the kind of advice you only appreciate after you've failed to use it. The Americans sent men with 200, sometimes 300
is
hours,
always in the approach.
enough sky in their bones to think with their hands. We met their experience with our intentions, and called it even, until the first merge proved it wasn't. Fuel is a truth teller. It decides who practices and who pretends. We pretended when the tanks ran low, saving sorties for combat and learning on the job, a phrase that frightens me more now than it did then. The Mustangs. And by now, it felt as if there were always. Mustangs did not just guard the bomber streams. They loitered over Germany for 30, 45 minutes, hunting soft edges, training fields, transport columns. The vulnerable hour between taxi and takeoff. Airfields are easy to find when you can afford time. We felt their presence in the way you feel, a hand on a door you thought was locked. Our mechanics could make miracles out of wire and will, but miracles do not scale. Industry does. The Americans had learned to build war like a habit. The P-51 was the right machine, not only because it reached us, but because it could be built in thousands, 15,000 and more. By the end, each one reliable enough to trust and simple enough to turn around quickly. It was also cheaper than a P-47, which meant the arithmetic of production smiled on it. We began to understand that we were fighting an airplane and an idea about airplanes, that a nation could flood the sky with good enough and thus make excellent irrelevant. Maintenance became a philosophy. Our ground crews wrenched until their knuckles turned permanent black. They scrounged, swapped, begged, and made parts out of other parts. The Mustangs seemed to ask less and give more. We could see it in the rhythm of their fields, sorties stacked like bricks. The same tail numbers returning, refueled, rearmed, and back in the air before our coffee cooled. A machine that starts
as
every
the
time
engine
is a strategy.
fades.
One
I
that
remember a
doesn't is
time
prayer.
of sore.
We kept accounts the way soldiers do on cigarette papers and in the tender parts of memory. In 43, trading a fighter for a bomber had felt like a cruel but favorable deal when you were defending your ceiling and your factories. By the summer of 44, the ratios inverted. We were being taken 3, sometimes 4 to 1. I do not offer this as an excuse. I offer it as a measurement, the sort that takes your breath not because the numbers are large, but because they are true. By summer, the mathematics turned cruel. A boy arrived with 40 hours in his logbook and a ribbon of bravado he wore like a scarf. He lasted 2 sorties. The Mustangs had patience to
Sometimes
spare.
the greatest
We mortgaged
victories are
ours at
not
takeoff.
won with a final shot,
If courage was a
but
currency,
with the quiet
we were rich for
observation
minutes
of an
and
adversary's
poor for
faltering.
hours. What the P-51 changed most was not the duel but the day. When escorts left early, the formation was a puzzle you could solve with the right violence at the right time. When escorts stayed, the puzzle became a clock that always struck against you. We learned to wait differently, eyes moving not from bomber to bomber but from pair to pair, reading their rotations, counting their altitude, guessing which rotate would press and which would watch. The Mustang pilots were not all aces. That is not the point. The point is that they were enough. Enough training, enough fuel, enough time to do their jobs without gambling. The ground learned the lesson too. Trains moved under clouds more often. Fuel convoys tried midnight and back roads. We dispersed aircraft to lanes cut in woods and fields no farmer would have offered in peace. The Mustangs found them in the margin the 5 minutes after wheels up, 10 before the pattern, the imagined safety between missions. War loves margins when you can afford to reap them. One morning in June we woke to a rumor that did not sound like weather or wish, an invasion. It came with the smell of salt and the sound of distant thunder that turned out to be sorties, nearly 14,000 of them in a single day. Our answer, a meager 319. I did not see Normandy with my own eyes. I heard it in the air, a roar that did not ebb. When superiority becomes saturation, names like air superiority feel polite. After that, the air over Germany felt like an aftermath waiting to be tallied. The Mustangs were not alone. Thunderbolts still delved. Lightnings still descended. But the silver P-51 had become the shape of an afternoon you could not escape. They roamed with the unhurried menace of men who know they can be everywhere that matters, and a few places that don't, just to make a point. Our accidents were no longer heroic. A burst caught a truck that carried nothing but bread. A pass scattered men on bicycles on a runway we had pretended was a road. A mechanic I liked for his quiet jokes went missing between hangars during a strafing that lasted 3 minutes and changed the mood of a month. If I sound bitter, I am not. Bitterness requires the belief that things could have been different. I have fewer beliefs now. Every debrief grew the same route, time. The Americans had it in their training, their tanks, their factories. We made brave decisions. They made good ones because their system allowed it. The P-51 was not a miracle. It was a conclusion of engines, perfected elsewhere, of tanks, light enough to be dropped, of airframes that did not need charm to start in the cold. You can admire a hero, you should fear a conclusion. Prison came to me in 45 with less drama than you imagine. A camp with wire that looked tired of its own duties, a hut that smelled of damp straw and men trying to remember how to speak softly. One afternoon, an English officer with kind eyes asked me questions in a voice that could have been used to order tea, not traps, reckonings. We spoke of tactics and of days that had become landmarks for men on opposite sides of the same sky. He asked what beat us. I tried shapes, first angles, merges, the high right cut I still see when I close my eyes. He smiled, like a man listening to a favorite story, told by a new friend. And besides that, he said, I thought of Kiel, of Oschersleben, of the boy with the scarf grin in 50 Hours. I thought of drop tanks tumbling like coins, and of a fuselage tank hidden like a second spine. I thought of the smell of fuel that lived in our coats, long after the ration stopped. We weren't beaten by a better airplane alone, I said at last, surprising myself with the calm of it, but by time, fuel, and factories behind it. He wrote that down and then closed his notebook as if the conversation were finished. Perhaps it was. There is a kind of honesty that only comes after surrender. I do not mean flags and signatures. I mean the smaller surrender you make to the arithmetic of the world. Hours matter. Fuel matters. A machine you can build again and again matters most. The Mustang embodied that arithmetic and then taught it to us at gunpoint. In the end, what changed the sky was not that the P-51 could win a duel, though it could, but that it could be present where duels became battles and where battles became policies. Presence is a weapon. Patience is a strategy. We learned both from men we tried to kill and who tried to kill us, which is a tidy sentence for an untidy truth. If you collect enough days like Oschersleben, you stop looking for the moment the war turned and start counting the moments it refused to turn back. The ratios, the sorties, the loiter, none of them are poetry. They are the prose of defeat. It does not sound grand, but it reads clearly. I have heard it said that technology wins wars. I think organization does, and technology is its accent. The Mustang spoke with a beautiful accent. It said what the factories and the training schools and the fuel depots were already declaring: we can stay. Against that, our courage measured exactly as far as our tanks could carry it. When I close my eyes now, I do not see heroics. I see time laid out like a runway as long as a continent, and silver wings using all of it. We told ourselves once that numbers were on our side. In 1944, the numbers chose a side without asking us. There is a drawer in my desk that smells faintly of petrol and damp paper. Inside, beneath a coil of string and a fountain pen that no longer writes, I keep a photograph. 3 faces in leather and wool, goggles cocked to catch a little swagger from the Sunday we were a rotte, and something more 3 men pretending a pair could be a trinity. 3 faces, 2 returned. I do not take the photograph out often. The past prefers low light. When I think of the Mustang now, I do not summon the clean angles and the polished skin first. I remember a feeling, as tangible as frost on a windscreen. Presence. It was not invincible.
Germany
I have
invested
seen
heavily
faster
in
machines on
advanced
paper,
aircraft designs,
tighter turners in
developing
certain corners of the
formidable
sky,
fighters like the Messerschmitt
brutes with more guns
Bf-109 and
and
Focke-Wulf
claws.
F.
Check the fuel
But
line.
the P-51 was the right
Roger
machine
that.
at the right hour, present in the right numbers, attached to the right supply of fuel and men. It spoke the language
Precision
that a long
in
war
every move.
understands: schedule,
Fluency
reliability,
in every
return
flight.
rate. And it spoke it fluently. We like to build monuments to moments. A single duel, a perfect shot, a day that seemed to bend the horizon. I have those too, stitched into memory with cords I cannot cut. But what won the air above Europe was not a handful of moments. It was a method. Training that lasted long enough to teach judgment. Engines that started in the cold. Tanks that fed an hour more than expected. Factories that made replacements without drama. The Mustang did not create that method. It revealed it every time it stayed when we expected it to leave. I have no sermon to give, only a courtesy to pay. To the men who flew against me in silver airplanes, and to the men who turned wrenches under canvas roofs with fuel on their hands. We were enemies by order and neighbors by weather. The sky reduced us to simple arithmetic: height, speed. Time then returned us to being human. When the engines stopped, some lived, some did not. I will not pretend bravery belonged to only one color of paint. Sometimes I take the long road home to pass an airfield that is now only grass and stories. Children fly kites, where we once counted seconds of cannon fire. The wind is clean there. It does not remember the smell of B4. On those walks I remind myself of the lesson I learned too late to be useful. Machines matter, but systems decide. The Mustang was a beautiful sentence.
We are
written
so
in the
used to
grammar of
machines
organization.
and systems.
If Americans ask what I think of the Mustang, I tell them the truth.
There are
I
some things
respected
that
it.
stick with you
I
forever.
feared it, and I learned.
Every second ticking
Too
by.
late.
Every
The
drop
wars
of fuel.
are not won by
every
heroes alone,
rivet in
but
these
by hours.
factories.
Fuel
They built our
and
victory.
factories.